Rothschilds controlled banking, the Sassoons controlled opium, but there's a family you walk past every time you visit a museum that made both look like amateurs. The Sacklers didn't control 70% of a market. They created the market. They invented a pill that killed more Americans than every war since Vietnam combined. 500,000 dead, $35 billion extracted. And their name is still on the walls of the Met, the Louvre, Harvard, Oxford. They didn't just sell drugs, they bought legitimacy with the bodies. Here's what nobody tells you about America's deadliest drug epidemic. It wasn't started by cartels. It was started by 3 Jewish brothers from Brooklyn who understood something the Sassoons never did. You don't need gunboats when you have doctors. And if you find yourself gripped by this story, hit subscribe, because what comes next reveals how they almost got away with it completely. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Arthur Sackler wasn't supposed to revolutionize anything. He was supposed to be a doctor. Born in 1913 in Brooklyn, New York, Arthur was the first son of Isaac and Sophie Sackler, Jewish immigrants who had fled the pogroms and poverty of Galicia, a region that straddled what is now Poland and Ukraine. Isaac Sackler had arrived in America with nothing but the clothes on his back and a desperate belief that this country would be different, that his children would have opportunities he never had. He opened a small grocery store in Flatbush, working 16-hour days, saving every penny, building the kind of modest working-class existence that millions of Jewish immigrants carved out in the tenements and row houses of early 20th century New York. Sophie bore 3 sons in quick succession. Arthur in 1913, Mortimer in 1916, Raymond in 1920. 3 boys who would grow up sharing beds, sharing clothes, sharing the unspoken understanding that they would have to work twice as hard as everyone else just to be considered equal. The Sackler household was not wealthy, but it was stable. Isaac made enough to keep food on the table and the boys in school. Sophie kept a kosher home and made sure her sons understood that education was the only ladder that could lift them out of poverty. Arthur, the eldest, absorbed this lesson completely. He was brilliant in the way that immigrant children often are, understanding instinctively that every opportunity had to be seized because nothing would be given freely. He excelled in school, particularly in science, but what really set him apart was his ability to talk, to persuade, to make people see things his way. Even as a teenager, Arthur Sackler had the gift. He could sell anything to anyone. Then the Depression hit and everything Isaac Sackler had built collapsed overnight. The grocery store failed in 1929 when Arthur was 16. The family lost nearly everything. Isaac never really recovered. He spent the rest of his life working odd jobs, a broken man who had seen the American Nabdvas dream crumble in his hands. But his sons, his 3 sons, they responded to poverty not with despair but with ferocious determination. Arthur got a job selling advertising space on the New York subway system. He would ride the trains for hours, approaching businesses, convincing them that a small card above the seats would bring them customers. He was 17 years old and he was learning the most important lesson of his life. People don't buy products, they buy stories, they buy feelings, they buy solutions to problems they didn't know they had. Mortimer and Raymond watched their older brother and learned. All 3 boys worked their way through school. They took any job they could find, they studied at night, they shared textbooks because they couldn't afford 3 copies, and all 3 of them, every single one, decided to become doctors. Think about what that meant in 1930s America. Medical school was extensive, competitive, and explicitly hostile to Jews. The quotas were real. Elite medical schools had hard caps on Jewish enrollment, sometimes as low as 5%. Jewish applicants needed higher grades, better test scores, more impressive credentials just to be considered. And even if you got in, even if you graduated, the best hospital positions, the prestigious residencies, the paths to professional success were largely closed to you. The Sackler brothers faced all of this and pushed through anyway. Arthur graduated from NYU School of Medicine in 1937. Mortimer followed in 1939. Raymond completed his degree in 1943. 3 brothers, 3 doctors, all from a family that had lost everything in the Depression. It should have been a triumphant American success story, but here's the thing about being an outsider. You see the system differently. You notice the gaps, the inefficiencies, the opportunities that insiders overlook because they've never had to look. Arthur Sackler looked at American medicine in the late 1930s, and he saw something that nobody else seemed to notice. He saw that pharmaceutical companies were terrible at selling drugs. Arthur took a position at Creedmoor Psychiatric Hospital in Queens after his residency. It was not a prestigious posting. Creedmoor was a massive state institution, overcrowded, underfunded, warehousing thousands of patients with severe mental illness. But for Arthur, it was an education. He watched pharmaceutical sales representatives come through the hospital. He saw how they pitched their products to doctors, and he realized that they were doing it completely wrong. The drug companies approached doctors as if they were selling to scientists. They presented data, clinical trial results, mechanism of action, side effect profiles, dry, technical, boring. They assumed that doctors would make purely rational decisions based on evidence. Arthur knew better. He had spent years selling advertising on subways. He understood that humans don't make decisions rationally. They make decisions emotionally and then rationalize them afterward. Doctors were no different. They just had more elaborate rationalizations. This insight would eventually be worth billions of dollars. But first, Arthur had to prove it. In 1942, while still working at Creedmoor, Arthur took a job at a small medical advertising agency called William Douglas McAdams. He started part-time, writing copy, designing campaigns, learning the business. Within 2 years, he was running the place. By 1947, he had bought the agency outright. The William Douglas McAdams agency became Arthur's laboratory for testing his theory about doctors and advertising. His approach was revolutionary. Instead of treating doctors as rational scientists, he treated them as consumers with specific psychological vulnerabilities. Doctors, Arthur realized, were actually more susceptible to advertising than regular consumers, not less. Why? Because doctors believed they were immune. They thought their medical training protected them from manipulation. They trusted their own judgment completely. This made them perfect targets. A regular consumer might be skeptical of an advertisement, might wonder if they're being sold something they don't need. A doctor would never question their own prescribing decisions that way. They were professionals. They were scientists. They were making rational choices based on evidence. Arthur understood that this confidence was the vulnerability. If you could make a doctor feel that prescribing a particular drug was the smart, evidence-based, professionally respectable choice, they would prescribe it without ever recognizing they had been advertised to. The key was making the advertising not look like advertising. Arthur pioneered what he called ethical pharmaceutical marketing. The word ethical was deliberately chosen. It implied that this wasn't the crass commercialism of consumer products. This was education. This was science. This was helping doctors make better decisions for their patients. The techniques Arthur developed at McAdams in the late 1940s would become the standard playbook for pharmaceutical marketing for the next 7 decades. He created medical journal advertisements that looked like scientific papers. He paid doctors to put their names on articles that were actually written by advertising copywriters. He funded continuing medical education programs that were really extended sales pitches. He built networks of key opinion leaders, prominent doctors who would be paid to speak at conferences and dinners, lending their credibility to whatever drug they were promoting. What Arthur understood, what made him genuinely brilliant in a dark way, was that the doctor-patient relationship was the most valuable real estate in healthcare. If you could influence what doctors believed, you controlled what patients received. You didn't need to advertise to patients at all. You just needed to capture the doctors. And doctors, despite their training, despite their intelligence, despite their genuine desire to help patients, were human beings with the same psychological vulnerabilities as everyone else. They responded to authority, to social proof, to fear of missing out, to the desire to be seen as cutting-edge and competent. Arthur Sackler mapped these vulnerabilities and learned to exploit them systematically. The work was lucrative. By the end of the 1940s, Arthur was making more money from McAdams than he ever could have made as a physician. His brothers Mortimer and Raymond were still practicing medicine, but they were watching Arthur carefully. They saw what he was building. They understood that the real money in healthcare wasn't in treating patients. It was in shaping how patients were treated. The family was also beginning to acquire assets. In 1952, the 3 brothers purchased a small pharmaceutical company called Purdue Frederick. It was not an impressive acquisition. Purdue Frederick made laxatives, earwax removal drops, antiseptic solutions, boring low-margin products that nobody paid much attention to. But it was a pharmaceutical company, a platform, a vehicle that could be used for something bigger when the time was right. Arthur kept the company separate from his advertising work. On paper, there was no connection between McAdams and Purdue Frederick. But in practice, Arthur was building an integrated system. He had an advertising agency that could market drugs. He had a pharmaceutical company that could sell them, and he had two brothers who were doctors who understood medicine, who could provide professional credibility. The pieces were all in place. Looking back at Arthur Sackler's early career, you can see two stories depending on how you want to read them. The first story is inspiring. A child of immigrants facing discrimination and poverty uses his intelligence and drive to build a successful business. He identifies an inefficiency in the market, applies his understanding of human psychology, and creates value. This is the American dream. This is what we're supposed to celebrate. The second story is darker. A man discovers that doctors can be manipulated like any other consumer, that scientific authority can be manufactured through advertising, that the trust patients place in physicians can be exploited for profit. He builds a system designed to compromise the integrity of medical decision-making, to insert commercial interests into the sacred space between doctor and patient. This is not the American dream. This is the corruption of it. Both stories are true. That is the uncomfortable reality of Arthur Sackler and his brothers. They were brilliant and they were driven, and they overcame genuine obstacles, and they built something that would eventually kill hundreds of thousands of people. The seeds of the opioid epidemic were planted in a Brooklyn row house during the Depression, watered by anti-Semitism and poverty, and a fierce determination to succeed at any cost. The boys who shared beds and textbooks grew up to share something else, a willingness to see healthcare not as a calling but as a market, patients not as people to be healed but as consumers to be captured. By 1952, Arthur Sackler had discovered something worth more than any drug formula. He had discovered that doctors could be programmed. Their prescribing habits could be shaped through careful application of advertising techniques disguised as medical education. Their trust in their own judgment made them vulnerable rather than protected. And the regulatory system that was supposed to ensure drug safety and honest marketing was laughably easy to circumvent if you knew what you were doing. Arthur Sackler knew what he was doing, and he was about to prove it with a little yellow pill that would change psychiatry forever. Before Arthur Sackler, pharmaceutical companies thought they were in the business of making drugs. Arthur taught them they were in the business of making patients. This distinction would prove to be worth billions of dollars, and it all started with a Swiss pharmaceutical company called Hoffmann-La Roche, and a minor tranquilizer that nobody thought would amount to much. In 1960, Roche released a drug called Librium, the first of a new class of medications called benzodiazepines. The chemistry was genuinely novel. Benzodiazepines worked differently from the barbiturates that had dominated the sedative market for decades. They were safer in overdose, less likely to cause fatal respiratory depression, and they had a calming effect that patients described as taking the edge off without completely sedating them. But here was the problem. Librium was effective but unremarkable. Doctors who tried it reported that it worked fine for anxiety, but so did the barbiturates they were already prescribing. The clinical data was solid but not spectacular. Roche had invested millions in developing the drug and now faced the prospect of modest sales in a crowded market. They needed something to differentiate Librium, to make doctors see it as essential rather than optional, to transform it from one of many choices into the obvious first-line treatment. They needed Arthur Sackler. Arthur had been building his medical advertising empire throughout the 1950s. His agency, William Douglas McAdams, had become the dominant force in pharmaceutical marketing, handling accounts for some of the biggest drug companies in the world. His methods were well known within the industry, if not to the general public. He had pioneered the use of detailed physician surveys to understand prescribing habits. He had developed sophisticated targeting systems to identify which doctors were high prescribers and which were resistant. He had created educational programs that were really extended advertisements, symposiums and conferences, where doctors could earn continuing education credits while being exposed to carefully crafted marketing messages. When Roche approached Arthur about Librium, he saw immediately what they were doing wrong. They were marketing the drug. They should have been marketing the disease. This insight sounds simple, but it was revolutionary. The traditional approach to pharmaceutical advertising focused on the medication itself, its mechanism of action, its efficacy data, its side effect profile, its advantages over competitors. Arthur understood that this approach had a fundamental limitation. You could only sell a drug to people who already believed they needed it. If you wanted to truly expand a market, you had to expand the definition of who was sick. Arthur launched a campaign for Librium that barely mentioned the drug at all. Instead, it focused on anxiety as a medical condition that was vastly underdiagnosed and undertreated, The advertisements appeared in medical journals, but they didn't look like advertisements. They looked like public health announcements, urgent messages to the medical community about a hidden epidemic. Millions of Americans were suffering from pathological anxiety, the campaigns warned. They were showing up in doctors' offices with vague complaints, insomnia, fatigue, headaches, gastrointestinal problems, difficulty concentrating, and too often doctors were missing the underlying cause. They were treating symptoms instead of the disease. They were failing their patients. The genius of this approach was that it weaponized doctors' own professional anxiety. No physician wants to miss a diagnosis. No physician wants to be told that they are undertreating their patients, that they are behind the times, that they are failing to recognize a condition that their more enlightened colleagues have already identified. Arthur's campaigns created a new fear in the medical community, the fear of the undiagnosed anxiety patient, the fear of the missed opportunity to help, the fear of being the last doctor in your community to recognize what everyone else already knew. And conveniently, there was a solution. Librium, the safe, effective modern treatment for the anxiety epidemic that was hiding in plain sight in every medical practice in America. The strategy worked beyond anyone's expectations. Librium sales exploded. Within 2 years of launch, it was one of the most prescribed drugs in America. Doctors who had never particularly thought about anxiety as a distinct condition were suddenly diagnosing it everywhere. Patients who had lived with stress and worry as normal parts of life were suddenly being told they had a medical condition that required treatment. The market hadn't just grown, it had been created. But Arthur was just getting started. In 1963, Roche released Valium, a second-generation benzodiazepine that was even more potent than Librium. Arthur saw Valium as an opportunity to perfect the techniques he had developed. If Librium had been a test run, Valium would be the full-scale deployment of his marketing philosophy. The Valium campaigns expanded the definition of anxiety even further. It wasn't just clinical anxiety that needed treatment anymore. It was the stress of modern life itself. Arthur's advertisements depicted ordinary people in ordinary situations, a housewife overwhelmed by the demands of managing a home, a businessman struggling with the pressures of his career, a student facing the anxiety of exams, an elderly person coping with the challenges of aging. These weren't psychiatric patients. These were normal people experiencing normal emotions, and the message was clear: normal was no longer acceptable. Why suffer when there was a pill that could help? The campaign specifically targeted general practitioners rather than psychiatrists. This was a crucial strategic decision. Psychiatrists were a small market and they were already familiar with prescribing sedatives. General practitioners were a much larger market, and they were largely untapped. More importantly, general practitioners saw patients who would never think to visit a psychiatrist. The housewife who mentioned to her family doctor that she was feeling stressed. The businessman who complained of insomnia during his annual physical. The student who seemed nervous during a routine checkup. These were opportunities, moments when a prescription pad could be deployed to solve a problem that the patient might not even have identified as a problem. Arthur created training materials for Roche's sales representatives that taught them how to educate general practitioners about the hidden epidemic of anxiety. The reps were instructed to position themselves not as salespeople but as partners in patient care, helping busy doctors recognize and treat a condition that was often overlooked. They brought journal articles, most of which had been written or funded by the company. They brought testimonials from respected physicians, many of whom were paid consultants. They brought free samples, enough to get patients started on the medication before they even had to fill a prescription. The sales force became an extension of the marketing machine, carrying the message directly into doctors' offices across America. Arthur also pioneered the use of key opinion leaders in pharmaceutical marketing. He identified prominent physicians, academics with prestigious institutional affiliations, doctors who published frequently and spoke at conferences. He cultivated relationships with them, offered them consulting fees, funded their research, helped them publish papers. In return, they lent their credibility to the product. When a Harvard professor spoke at a medical conference about the importance of treating anxiety, when a chairman of psychiatry published a paper about the safety and efficacy of benzodiazepines, it didn't look like advertising. It looked like science. But Arthur was paying for it. The academic papers were often ghostwritten by his agency staff and then attributed to the famous physicians. The conferences were funded by pharmaceutical money. The entire apparatus of scientific consensus was being Manufactured by an advertising agency in New York, the results were staggering. Valium sales grew year after year, climbing past milestones that no drug had ever reached. By 1968, Valium was the most prescribed drug in America. By 1978, it had become the first drug in history to reach $1 billion in annual sales. At its peak, American doctors were writing more than 65 million prescriptions for Valium every year. 1 in 5 women and 1 in 13 men in America were taking benzodiazepines. The drug had become so ubiquitous that it entered popular culture. The Rolling Stones wrote a song about it, calling Valium Mother's Little Helper. Housewives joke about their Valium prescriptions. The little yellow pill had become as American as apple pie. Arthur Sackler had done something unprecedented. He had taken a minor tranquilizer and turned it into a cultural phenomenon. He had convinced an entire nation that the stresses of ordinary life were medical conditions requiring pharmaceutical intervention. He had created a market worth billions of dollars essentially out of thin air, and he had done it all while remaining almost completely invisible. His name appeared nowhere in the advertisements. His agency worked behind the scenes. The public credited Roche with Valium's success. The medical community credited the drug itself. Nobody talked about the advertising man who had engineered the whole thing, but there was a problem developing, a problem that Arthur either didn't see or chose to ignore. People who took Valium for extended periods were becoming dependent on it. They found that they couldn't stop taking the drug without experiencing withdrawal symptoms, rebound anxiety, insomnia, tremors, in severe cases seizures. The medication that was supposed to treat anxiety was creating a new form of anxiety, the anxiety of dependency, the fear of what would happen if the pill stopped working or became unavailable. By the early 70s, reports of Valium addiction were appearing in medical journals. Patients were showing up in emergency rooms in withdrawal. Doctors were beginning to recognize that the drug they had been prescribing so freely had a darker side. The FDA started receiving adverse event reports. Journalists began investigating. In 1975, the Senate held hearings on the benzodiazepine epidemic. The testimony was damning. Witness after witness described how they had become addicted to a drug their doctor told them was safe. Physicians admitted that they had been overprescribing, that they had underestimated the risks, that they had believed the marketing materials without questioning them. The scope of the problem became clear. Millions of Americans were dependent on benzodiazepines, and the medical system that had created this epidemic had no plan for addressing it. Roche faced intense criticism. The company's executives were hauled before Congress, forced to answer questions about what they knew and when they knew it. The FDA imposed new restrictions on benzodiazepine prescribing. The medical establishment began to pull back, warning doctors to be more cautious, to limit prescriptions, to watch for signs of dependency. The golden age of Valium was ending. But here's what's remarkable. Arthur Sackler escaped unscathed. His name never came up in the congressional hearings. The journalists investigating the Valium epidemic focused on Roche, on doctors, on the FDA, but not on the advertising agency that had orchestrated the entire campaign. Arthur had built a system that shielded him from accountability. The advertisements were published in the names of Roche and its paid consultants. The academic papers were attributed to the key opinion leaders, not to the ghostwriters at McAdams. The sales representatives worked for the pharmaceutical company, not the advertising agency. When things went wrong, when the addiction crisis became impossible to ignore, there was nobody pointing fingers at Arthur Sackler. He was invisible. He had collected his fees, built his fortune, and walked away clean. The pattern is important because it would repeat itself. Arthur Sackler had created something unprecedented, an addiction crisis powered by medical authority. Doctors were the dealers, prescriptions were the product, and nobody could blame the advertising man hiding behind the lab coats. He had proven that you could market a drug so aggressively that it created a public health crisis, and as long as you structured the relationships correctly, you could avoid all responsibility for the consequences. This was the Valium blueprint. Create the disease, market the cure, use doctors as the distribution network, hide behind scientific authority, and when people start getting hurt, make sure someone else takes the blame. Arthur Sackler didn't invent these techniques with Valium. He had been developing them for years, but Valium was the proof of concept, the demonstration that the system worked at massive scale. $1 billion in sales, 65 million prescriptions per year, millions of addicts, zero consequences for the man who made it all possible. But Valium was just practice. Arthur had two brothers, Mortimer and Raymond, and they had been watching his success carefully. They had their own pharmaceutical company now, Purdue Frederick, still making laxatives and earwax drops. But they were ambitious. They wanted something bigger. They wanted their own blockbuster. And they had learned from Arthur that the way to create a blockbuster wasn't to develop a better drug, it was to develop a better story. What they would build together over the coming decades would make Valium look like aspirin. The opioid epidemic was still years away, but the template had been established. The infrastructure was in place. The family had learned how to turn pills into profits and suffering into statistics that could be ignored. All they needed now was the right molecule. The Sackler brothers didn't start Purdue Pharma. They bought it. And they bought it with money that shouldn't exist on paper, from a man who made laxatives. In 1952, while Arthur was building his advertising empire and revolutionizing pharmaceutical marketing, he and his brothers Mortimer and Raymond pooled their resources to acquire a small company called Purdue Frederick. The seller was a physician named Raymond Matzinger, who had built a modest business selling unglamorous products to an unglamorous market. Purdue Frederick manufactured laxatives, earwax removal drops, antiseptic solutions, and other products that pharmacists kept on back shelves and doctors rarely thought about. It was exactly the kind of company that nobody would notice, and that was precisely the point. The acquisition cost was modest, somewhere in the range of $50,000, though the exact figure has never been publicly disclosed because Purdue Frederick was a private company, and the Sacklers intended to keep it that way. The brothers structured the purchase so that ownership was divided among them, with Arthur holding the largest share initially, followed by Mortimer and Raymond. From the very beginning, they established patterns that would define the company for the next 7 decades: secrecy, family control, and an almost pathological avoidance of public scrutiny. The structure they created was deliberately complex. Arthur continued to run his advertising agency, William Douglas McAdams, as a separate entity. Mortimer and Raymond took operational control of Purdue Frederick, handling the day-to-day business of manufacturing and selling the company's products. But there was an obvious connection that nobody outside the family was supposed to notice. Arthur's agency handled the marketing for Purdue Frederick. The same man who was being paid to advertise the company's products was also a major shareholder in the company itself. The conflicts of interest were baked in from the very first day. In any publicly traded company, this arrangement would have required disclosure. Shareholders would have had questions. Regulators might have raised concerns. But Purdue Frederick was private, owned entirely by 3 brothers who answered to no one but themselves. There were no shareholder meetings, no annual reports, no securities filings, no obligation to tell anyone anything about how the company was run or how its profits were distributed. The Sacklers had created a black box, a corporate structure that allowed them to operate with complete opacity while building wealth that would eventually reach into the billions. For the first 3 decades of their ownership, Purdue Frederick remained exactly what it had been when they bought it: a small, boring, profitable company selling products that nobody talked about. The laxatives sold steadily. The earwax drops maintained their market share. The antiseptics found their way into medicine cabinets across America. The brothers collected their profits quietly, reinvesting some in the business, distributing the rest among themselves, building personal fortunes that grew year after year without attracting any attention. Meanwhile, Arthur was becoming one of the wealthiest men in America through his advertising work. The Valium campaign had made him rich, and he followed it with equally successful campaigns for other pharmaceutical companies. He was handling accounts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, taking his percentage, accumulating art and real estate and investments that would eventually be valued at over $300 million. But Arthur never lost interest in Purdue Frederick. He saw the little laxative company as something more than a side investment. He saw it as a platform, a vehicle that could eventually be used for something much bigger than earwax drops. The opportunity came in the 1980s, and it came from an unexpected direction: pain management. For most of the 20th century, the treatment of severe pain had been dominated by morphine. Morphine was effective, cheap, and well understood. It was also terrifying to most doctors. The word itself carried cultural baggage that went back centuries: addiction, overdose, the opium dens of Victorian imagination, the desperate junkies of urban nightmares. Doctors would prescribe morphine for cancer patients in their final days, but they were extremely reluctant to use it for anything else. The fear of creating addicts was so powerful that physicians routinely undertreated pain, leaving patients to suffer rather than risk the stigma and legal scrutiny that came with prescribing opioids. Purdue saw an opportunity in this reluctance. The company had developed expertise in sustained-release drug formulations, technologies that allowed medications to be released slowly over many hours rather than all at once. This technology had obvious applications for pain management. If you could create a morphine pill that released the drug gradually over 12 hours, patients would get steady pain relief without the peaks and valleys of immediate release formulations. In theory, this might even reduce addiction risk, since the slow release would prevent the rush that drug seekers craved. In 1987, Purdue released MS-Contin, a sustained-release morphine tablet designed for chronic pain. The drug was a genuine innovation, the first morphine product that allowed patients to take a pill every 12 hours instead of every 4. For cancer patients and others with severe chronic pain, MS-Contin represented a real improvement in quality of life. They could sleep through the night without waking to take medication. They could go about their daily activities without constantly watching the clock. The medical community responded positively, and MS-Contin became a successful product, eventually generating several $100 million in annual revenue. But MS-Contin had a fundamental limitation that no amount of marketing could overcome. It was morphine. The word appeared right there on the label. Every time a doctor wrote a prescription for MS-Contin, they were writing a prescription for morphine, and all the cultural baggage that came with that word followed the prescription into the pharmacy. Many doctors remained reluctant to prescribe it except for the most severe cases. Patients were sometimes afraid to take it. The market was real but constrained by fear. Arthur Sackler died in May 1987, just months before MS-Contin reached the market. He was 73 years old and he had accumulated a fortune that would be valued at somewhere between $300 million and $500 million, depending on how you counted his art collection. His death created a crisis for the family. Arthur had been the visionary, the marketing genius, the one who understood how to turn drugs into blockbusters. Mortimer and Raymond had run the operations, but Arthur had provided the strategic imagination. More practically, Arthur's death meant that his share of Purdue Frederick needed to be dealt with. His estate was complicated, involving multiple marriages and children from different relationships, and there was potential for conflict over who would inherit his stake in the family company. Mortimer and Raymond moved quickly. They negotiated with Arthur's heirs to buy out his share of Purdue Frederick, reportedly paying somewhere in the range of $22 million. When the transactions were complete, Mortimer and Raymond owned the company entirely. Arthur was gone, but his brothers had absorbed his stake and now controlled Purdue without any need to share decision-making authority with his descendants. The company was now entirely theirs, more concentrated, more private, more invisible than ever. The brothers also understood that they faced a looming problem. MS-Contin's patent was scheduled to expire in 2000. When that happened, generic manufacturers would flood the market with cheap copies, and Purdue would lose its competitive advantage. The company needed a new product, a successor to MS-Contin, that could generate even larger revenues and carry the company into the 21st century. They needed a blockbuster. The scientist who would provide that blockbuster was already working for Purdue. His name was Robert Kaiko, and he had been instrumental in developing the sustained-release technology behind MS-Contin. Kaiko understood that the problem with morphine was not primarily pharmacological. It was psychological and cultural. The word morphine frightened people. It conjured images of addiction and death. If you could create a sustained-release opioid that was just as effective as morphine but carried a different name, you might be able to overcome the psychological resistance that limited MS-Contin's market. The molecule Kaiko focused on was oxycodone. Oxycodone had been around since 1916. It was a semi-synthetic opioid derived from thebaine, a component of opium. In terms of its effects on the human body, oxycodone was essentially equivalent to morphine. It bound to the same receptors, produced the same pain relief, carried the same risks of addiction and overdose. But oxycodone had one crucial advantage: nobody was afraid of it. The word oxycodone didn't trigger the same cultural associations as morphine. It sounded clinical, modern, scientific. A doctor could prescribe oxycodone and feel like they were giving their patient something different from the scary narcotics of the past. A patient could take oxycodone and tell themselves they weren't really taking morphine. The distinction was largely illusory, but illusions, as Arthur Sackler had proven with Valium, were worth billions of dollars. The Sackler brothers had spent 35 years learning how to operate invisibly. They had built a private company with no public reporting requirements, no shareholder oversight, no obligation to disclose anything about their finances or their operations. They had watched Arthur create the modern pharmaceutical marketing playbook, and they had seen how it could be used to transform ordinary drugs into cultural phenomena. They had developed a sustained-release technology that genuinely improved the treatment of pain. And now they had a scientist who was working on a new formulation that would combine all of these elements. A sustained-release oxycodone pill that could be marketed as something fundamentally different from the morphine products that doctors were afraid to prescribe. They called it OxyContin. The name was carefully chosen. Oxy from oxycodone, Contin from their sustained-release technology. It sounded clean and modern and scientific. It didn't sound like something that could destroy lives. Arthur Sackler died believing he'd created the template for pharmaceutical success. He had shown how to market diseases rather than just drugs, how to use doctors as distribution networks, how to manufacture scientific consensus through paid consultants and ghost-written papers, how to build blockbusters worth billions while remaining invisible to the public. He had no idea that his brothers were about to use that template to create the greatest drug epidemic in American history. The foundation had been laid, the company was in place, the technology was ready. All that remained was the launch. OxyContin wasn't discovered, it was designed, and it was designed to be addictive while claiming it wasn't. The development process that led to OxyContin's 1996 launch reveals a company that understood exactly what it was creating and chose to obscure that understanding behind a fog of misleading claims and corrupted science. The molecule at the heart of OxyContin, oxycodone, was nothing new. German scientists had first synthesized it in 1916 as part of a search for alternatives to morphine and heroin. For 80 years, oxycodone had been used in various formulations, always with the understanding that it was a powerful opioid with significant addiction potential. Doctors prescribe it cautiously in combination products like Percocet and Percodan, where it was mixed with acetaminophen or aspirin to limit the amount patients could take without risking liver damage or stomach bleeding. The oxycodone in these products worked quickly, provided a few hours of pain relief, and then wore off. Patients who needed ongoing pain management had to take multiple pills throughout the day, which served as a natural check on consumption. Perdue's innovation was not the molecule, it was the delivery system. The company's Contin technology, the same sustained release mechanism used in mescontin, could be applied to oxycodone to create a pill that released the drug slowly over 12 hours. In theory, this offered genuine benefits for patients with chronic pain. Instead of taking a pill every 4 to 6 hours, they could take one pill in the morning and one at night. The slow release would maintain steady blood levels of the drug, avoiding the peaks and valleys of immediate release formulations. Pain control would be more consistent. Patients could sleep through the night. But Purdue recognized that sustained release technology also created a marketing opportunity that went far beyond convenience. The company began developing a narrative that the slow release mechanism didn't just improve pain control, it actually made the drug safer and less addictive than other opioids. This claim would become the foundation of OxyContin's marketing, and it was built on a lie. The scientific basis for the claim that OxyContin was less addictive than other opioids was essentially non-existent. Purdue pointed to a single piece of evidence, a letter published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1880 by a doctor named Herschel Jick. The letter was not a study. It was a brief paragraph, 5 sentences long, describing observations from a hospital database. Jick had noted that among nearly 12,000 hospitalized patients who received opioids for acute pain, only 4 cases of addiction were documented. He concluded that addiction was rare in medical patients with no history of addiction. The letter was specifically about hospitalized patients receiving opioids for short-term acute pain under medical supervision. It said nothing about outpatient prescribing, nothing about chronic pain treatment, nothing about sustained release formulations, nothing about oxycodone specifically. But Purdue seized on this letter as if it were definitive proof that their new drug was safe. Internal documents show that company scientists and marketers understood the limitations of this evidence. They knew the Jick letter did not support the broad claims they wanted to make, but they also knew that most doctors would never look up the original source. If Purdue said there was evidence that OxyContin had less than 1% addiction risk, doctors would believe it. The company that had learned from Arthur Sackler that physicians could be programmed was about to put that knowledge to use on a scale he never imagined. The Food and Drug Administration approved OxyContin in December 1995, and the approval itself became part of the deception. Purdue had requested something extraordinary, a label statement claiming that the sustained release mechanism reduced the drug's abuse potential. No opioid had ever received such a label. The FDA reviewer's initial instinct was to reject this language. There was no clinical evidence that sustained-release oxycodone was less addictive than immediate-release formulations. The absorption might be delayed, but the total amount of opioid reaching the brain was the same. If anything, the high concentration of oxycodone in each OxyContin pill, up to 160 milligrams in the highest dose formulation, created obvious abuse risks. Someone who crushed the pill could access the entire dose at once, bypassing the time-release mechanism and experiencing a rush of opioid more powerful than most heroin injections. But somewhere in the approval process, the FDA's position changed. The final label included language that would become infamous: delayed absorption. As provided by OxyContin tablets is believed to reduce the abuse liability of a drug. This single sentence was worth billions of dollars. It gave Purdue something no other opioid manufacturer had: official FDA endorsement of the claim that their drug was safer than the competition. Sales representatives could point to the label and tell doctors that even the FDA recognized OxyContin was different. The phrase is believed to was doing enormous work in that sentence, hedging the claim just enough to provide legal cover, while allowing Purdue to market the drug as if the reduced abuse liability were established a fact. The FDA reviewer who oversaw OxyContin's approval was a man named Curtis Wright. 2 years after approving the drug, Wright left the FDA. His new employer was Purdue Pharma. The company paid him somewhere in the range of $400,000 annually, a salary far higher than his government pay. Wright was not the only FDA official to move to Purdue after helping approve or regulate the company's products. The pattern was so consistent that it became difficult to see it as coincidence. Purdue had created a pipeline from the agency that regulated it to its own payroll, and officials who knew their career prospects might depend on the company's goodwill had obvious incentives to be accommodating. With FDA approval secured, Purdue turned to the launch strategy. This is where the full scope of the deception becomes clear. OxyContin had been developed and approved for the treatment of moderate to severe pain in patients who required continuous opioid treatment. The obvious market was cancer patients and others with severe chronic conditions, the same patients who were already receiving MS-Contin. Oncologists were experienced with opioids. They understood addiction risks. They monitored patients carefully. They would prescribe OxyContin responsibly. But responsible prescribing was not Purdue's goal. The company wanted volume. Cancer patients represented a relatively small market, and many of them were terminal, meaning they would not be long-term customers. If Purdue wanted OxyContin to become a blockbuster, it needed to reach beyond cancer into the vast universe of patients with non-malignant chronic pain. Back pain, arthritis, fibromyalgia, headaches, injuries. These patients numbered in the tens of millions, and they were largely being treated by primary care physicians rather than specialists. Primary care doctors became Purdue's target market: family physicians, internists, general practitioners. These were doctors who saw patients with pain complaints every day but had minimal training in pain management and even less training in addiction medicine. They were already overwhelmed with patient loads, pressed for time, eager for simple solutions to complex problems. They trusted pharmaceutical representatives. They relied on drug company materials for information about new medications. They were, in short, the perfect targets for the marketing playbook Arthur Sackler had developed decades earlier with Valium. Purdue built an army. At its peak, the company employed more than 1,000 sales representatives, a massive force for a company with essentially one product. These representatives were carefully trained in the OxyContin messaging. They were given scripts to follow, objections to overcome, talking points to memorize. The core message was simple and repeated endlessly. OxyContin is different. The time-release system reduces the risk of addiction. Less than 1% of patients become addicted when the drug is used as directed. Doctors who prescribe OxyContin are not creating addicts. They are relieving suffering. The representatives were also given data. Purdue had developed sophisticated systems for tracking physician prescribing patterns, and they used this information to identify the doctors most likely to prescribe high volumes of opioids. If a physician was already writing lots of narcotic prescriptions, they got more attention from Purdue, more visits, more free samples. more invitations to dinner programs and speaker events, more opportunities to earn consulting fees. The company was deliberately seeking out the doctors who were either most sympathetic to aggressive pain treatment or most careless about the risks of opioids. Some of these doctors were genuinely committed to treating pain and had become frustrated with a medical culture that they believed undertreated suffering. Others were running pill mills, writing prescriptions for cash with minimal examination. Purdue targeted both groups. The company also created an elaborate system of educational programs that were really marketing events in disguise. Purdue funded conferences and symposiums on pain management. It paid doctors to serve as speakers and consultants. It sponsored research at academics, medical centers. It gave grants to patient advocacy groups that promoted more aggressive opioid prescribing. Every element of this system was designed to create the appearance of scientific consensus around the safety of OxyContin, while actually manufacturing that consensus through strategic payments. The doctors who attended Purdue sponsored events, heard presentations about the new understanding of pain, about how fears of addiction had been overblown, about how responsible physicians recognized that opioids were essential tools for treating chronic pain. They were not told that the speakers had been selected and paid by Purdue, that the research had been funded by the company, that the patient advocacy groups were essentially front organizations for pharmaceutical interests. One internal Purdue document from this period captures the company's awareness of what it was doing. A 1909 memo discussed the potential for abuse and diversion of OxyContin, noting that the drug was being crushed and snorted or injected by people seeking a heroin-like high. The memo acknowledged reports of OxyContin-related crimes and deaths in certain regions, but it recommended no change in marketing strategy. Instead, it suggested messaging adjustments. Purdue should emphasize that abuse was the fault of criminals and addicts, not of the drug itself or the doctors prescribing it. The company knew people were dying and decided that the appropriate response was better public relations. The pricing strategy reinforced the push toward high-volume prescribing. Purdue offered discounts and rebates that rewarded pharmacies and healthcare systems for increasing OxyContin usage. It provided free trial coupons that allowed patients to get their first prescription at no cost, eliminating the financial barrier to starting the drug. Once patients were established on OxyContin, they would continue filling prescriptions for months or years, generating ongoing revenue streams. The free first hit is the oldest technique in drug dealing, and Purdue had simply adapted it for the prescription market. By the time of its official launch in 1996, OxyContin was not just a new drug. It was the culmination of everything the Sackler family had learned over 4 decades about how to manipulate the pharmaceutical market. The misleading safety claims echoed Arthur Sackler's strategy of creating narratives that trumped evidence. The targeting of primary care doctors followed his insight that untrained physicians were the most valuable market. The elaborate system of paid consultants and funded research replicated his technique of manufacturing scientific consensus. The sophisticated data systems for identifying high prescribers refined his approach of focusing marketing resources on the most profitable targets. Every element of the deception was intentional. The fake statistics about addiction rates were not honest mistakes. The corrupted FDA approval was not coincidence. The targeting of doctors with the least expertise in addiction was not accidental. The Sacklers didn't stumble into an epidemic. They engineered one. They took a drug that was pharmacologically almost identical to heroin, wrapped it in a sustained release coating, attached misleading safety claims, secured an FDA label that blessed those claims, built a 1,000-person sales force to promote it, targeted the doctors least equipped to recognize the dangers, and created financial incentives that rewarded exactly the kind of overprescribing that would maximize addiction. OxyContin launched in 1996. Within 5 years, it would generate more revenue than Viagra. Within 10 years, it would kill more Americans than car accidents, and the Sacklers were just getting started. OxyContin didn't spread like a disease, it was distributed like a product launch. The Sacklers had territories, quotas and bonuses. The only difference was their customers ended up dead. The years between 1996 and 2001 transformed OxyContin from a new pharmaceutical product into the engine of the deadliest drug epidemic in American history. And this transformation was not accidental. Every element of the catastrophe was planned, measured, and optimized for maximum sales. Purdue didn't simply release OxyContin and hope doctors would prescribe it. The company executed a systematic campaign to flood specific regions of the country with opioids, using sales techniques borrowed from consumer products companies and financial incentives that rewarded exactly the kind of reckless prescribing that would create mass addiction. The geography of the OxyContin epidemic was not random. Purdue analysed prescription data to identify regions where doctors were already prescribing high volumes of pain medications, where patient populations had high rates of chronic pain conditions, and where there was limited access to alternative treatments like physical therapy or specialist care. The company found its ideal markets in rural America, specifically in the small towns and depressed industrial regions of Appalachia, the Rust Belt, and northern New England. These communities shared characteristics that made them perfect targets. The populations included high proportions of manual labourers, miners, factory workers, and loggers whose bodies were broken by decades of physical work. Back injuries, knee problems, shoulder damage, and chronic pain conditions were endemic. Healthcare options were limited, often consisting of a single-family doctor or small clinic serving thousands of patients. These doctors were generalists without specialised training in pain management or addiction medicine. They trusted pharmaceutical representatives for information about new drugs because they had neither the time nor the resources to evaluate the medical literature themselves, and they wanted to help their patients, many of whom were genuinely suffering. Purdue sent its army of sales representatives into these communities with military precision. The company divided the country into sales territories and assigned quotas to each region. Representatives were expected to meet specific targets for OxyContin prescriptions, and their compensation depended on hitting those numbers. Miss your quota and you lost your bonus. Exceed it and you could earn tens of thousands of dollars on top of your base salary. In the highest performing years, some sales representatives earned annual bonuses exceeding $100,000. These incentives created exactly the behaviour Purdue wanted. Representatives were not rewarded for ensuring appropriate prescribing or patient safety. They were rewarded for volume. A representative who convinced a careful doctor to prescribe OxyContin to a handful of appropriate patients earned less than one who found a doctor willing to write prescriptions indiscriminately. The system selected for representatives who would seek out the highest prescribers regardless of whether those prescribers were practicing responsible medicine. Internal Purdue documents show that the company tracked not just total prescriptions but prescriptions per doctor, allowing them to identify which physicians were the most prolific sources of OxyContin scripts. These high prescribers received special attention, more frequent visits from sales representatives, more free samples, more invitations to paid speaking engagements, more access to company-sponsored educational programs. Some of these doctors were running what would later become known as pill mills, clinics that existed primarily to write prescriptions for cash with minimal medical examination. Purdue representatives knew these practices existed. They visited them. They counted them among their best customers. The speaker programs were perhaps the most insidious element of the marketing strategy. Purdue recruited thousands of doctors to serve as paid advocates for OxyContin, offering fees ranging from $500 to $3,000 per speaking engagement. These doctors were given presentations developed by Purdue, trained in delivering the company's talking points, and sent out to dinner programs and regional conferences to spread the OxyContin message to their peers. The format was carefully designed to blur the line between education and sales. A typical event would be held at an upscale restaurant. Doctors from the area would be invited to attend a free dinner, featuring a presentation on pain management. The presenting doctor, a local peer rather than a Purdue employee, would discuss the undertreatment of chronic pain and the importance of addressing patient suffering. OxyContin would be presented as a breakthrough medication that offered effective pain relief with minimal addiction risk. The audience members would ask questions, and the presenting doctor, drawing on talking points and materials provided by Purdue, would reassure them that OxyContin was safe and effective when used as directed. The psychology was powerful. Doctors are trained to trust peer-reviewed research and expert opinion. And here was a fellow physician, someone local and relatable, vouching for OxyContin safety. The setting was social rather than commercial, a pleasant dinner rather than an obvious sales pitch. The information came wrapped in the language of patient care and medical ethics. Prescribing OxyContin was presented not as a commercial decision, but as a moral imperative. Patients were suffering and responsible physicians had a duty to relieve that suffering. Withholding opioids was portrayed as the real danger, a form of cruelty driven by outdated fears about addiction. Purdue also deployed patient assistance programs designed to eliminate barriers to starting OxyContin therapy. The company offered free trial coupons that allowed patients to fill their first prescription at no cost. The explicit goal was to get patients past the initial hurdle of starting opioid therapy. Once they were taking OxyContin regularly, they would continue filling prescriptions at full price for months or years. Internal documents show that Purdue understood this approach as similar to strategies used by consumer products companies to acquire new customers. Get them to try the product once, and many will become repeat buyers. The difference, of course, was that OxyContin created physical dependence. Patients who took the drug for more than a few weeks developed tolerance, requiring higher doses for the same effect, and experienced withdrawal symptoms if they tried to stop. The free first prescription was not just a marketing tactic. It was the first step in creating a customer who could not easily walk away. The sales numbers tell the story of what this marketing machine produced. In 1996, OxyContin's first year on the market, Purdue recorded sales of $44 million. This was a solid launch for a new pharmaceutical product, but nothing extraordinary. By 1997, sales had more than doubled to over $100 million. By 1999, sales exceeded $500 million. By 2000, OxyContin crossed the billion-dollar threshold, reaching approximately $1.1 billion in annual revenue. By 2001, sales hit $1.6 billion. In 5 years, OxyContin had gone from new product to blockbuster, one of the most successful drug launches in pharmaceutical history. Purdue was transformed from a mid-sized family company into a powerhouse generating enormous profits. The Sacklers, who owned the company entirely, saw their personal wealth explode correspondingly. But another set of numbers was growing alongside the sales figures, and these numbers measured something very different. By 1999, reports of OxyContin abuse were flooding into the Drug Enforcement Administration and state health departments. Pharmacists in rural communities were calling to report suspicious prescriptions. Emergency rooms were seeing patients in overdose. Coroners were recording deaths in which OxyContin was identified as the primary cause. The geographic pattern of these reports was unmistakable. The same regions where Purdue had focused its marketing efforts were now experiencing unprecedented spikes in opioid addiction and overdose deaths. Eastern Kentucky became ground zero. Lee County, with a population of just 7,000, reported more than 50 overdose deaths in 2000 and 2001. Neighboring counties showed similar patterns. In some communities, the per capita rate of OxyContin prescriptions exceeded 1 prescription per resident per year. The entire Appalachian region, from southwestern Virginia through West Virginia and Kentucky into southern Ohio, was experiencing a coordinated surge in addiction that tracked almost perfectly with Purdue's sales territories. The pattern repeated in other targeted regions. Rural Maine, where poverty and manual labor created patient populations similar to Appalachia, saw dramatic increases in OxyContin prescriptions followed by equally dramatic increases in addiction and death. Small towns in the Pacific Northwest, the Upper Midwest, and the Gulf Coast all showed the same sequence. Purdue reps arrive, prescriptions spike, deaths follow. The correlation between sales and mortality was so consistent that it could not be dismissed as coincidence. Purdue's response to these early warnings established a pattern that would continue for years. The company denied, deflected, and blamed anyone except itself. When pharmacists reported concerns about suspicious prescriptions, Purdue accused them of being obstacles to patient care. When DEA agents raised alarms about diversion, Purdue complained about regulatory overreach interfering with legitimate pain treatment. When journalists began investigating overdose deaths, Purdue provided carefully crafted statements emphasizing that OxyContin was approved by the FDA and that abuse was the fault of criminals who were using the drug in ways not intended by the manufacturer. The company developed a specific strategy for handling reports of addiction and death: blame the victim. Internal communications show that Purdue officials consistently characterized people who became addicted to OxyContin as abusers rather than patients. They were criminals, they were drug seekers, they had prior histories of addiction or mental illness. They had crushed or snorted the pills rather than taking them as directed. They were not legitimate pain patients but infiltrators who had deceived doctors to obtain drugs for recreational use. This framing was crucial because it allowed Purdue to claim that the drug itself was safe. OxyContin didn't create addicts. Addicts abused OxyContin. The distinction was legally and morally convenient, but it was also deeply dishonest. Purdue knew from its own data that many people who became addicted had started as legitimate patients taking the drug exactly as prescribed. The company knew that the 12-hour dosing often failed, that many patients experienced breakthrough pain and withdrawal symptoms before their next scheduled dose, that doctors frequently responded by increasing doses or shortening intervals in ways that accelerated dependence. The company knew that once patients were physically dependent, the line between medical use and addiction became impossible to draw clearly. But acknowledging these realities would have meant acknowledging that OxyContin's problems were inherent in the product, not just in its misuse. The Sacklers received regular reports on OxyContin's performance, and these reports included information about abuse and diversion. The family members who controlled Purdue were not passive investors collecting dividend checks while managers handled the details. They were actively involved in strategic decisions, attending board meetings, reviewing sales data, and approving marketing plans. Richard Sackler, the son of Raymond Sackler, and the family member most deeply involved in OxyContin's launch, reportedly received detailed briefings on the drug's performance, including reports on abuse trends by region. The family knew which territories were showing what internal documents called explosive growth. They also knew that the same territories were showing explosive growth in addiction, diversion, and death. The correlation was obvious to anyone who looked at the data. High sales and high mortality were two sides of the same coin. But the Sacklers did not pull back. They did not restrict marketing in heavily affected regions. They did not implement additional safeguards against diversion. They did not warn doctors about emerging patterns of addiction. Instead, they pushed harder. Sales targets increased. Marketing intensified. New territories were opened. The strategy that was producing both record profits and record deaths continued without meaningful modification. By 2001, OxyContin had become the most abused drug in America. The diversion of OxyContin from legitimate medical channels into illegal markets had created a new street drug with predictable dosing and widespread availability. Addicts called it hillbilly heroin because of its prevalence in rural communities and its effects, which were essentially identical to heroin. The street price rose to $1 per milligram, making a single 80-milligram pill worth $80. People who had become addicted through legitimate prescriptions and lost access to their supply turned to the street market. People who could not afford street prices turned to crime to fund their addiction. People who could not access OxyContin at all just discovered that heroin, increasingly available and cheaper than pills, produced the same high. The opioid epidemic had begun, and it would not remain contained to pills. The human cost was already staggering. Thousands of people had died from OxyContin overdoses by 2001, though the exact number would never be precisely known because death certificates often listed the cause as opioid overdose, rather than specifying OxyContin. Tens of thousands more had become addicted and were living with a dependence that would shape the rest of their lives. Hundreds of thousands of prescriptions had been written, bottles of pills distributed, a pipeline of addiction flowing from Purdue's manufacturing facilities in New Jersey, through pharmacies across America, and into bodies that were being reshaped by chemical dependence. The Sacklers had become billionaires. Their names were appearing on museum wings and university buildings. Their philanthropy was purchasing the kind of cultural prestige that Arthur Sackler had pioneered decades earlier. They moved in circles of wealth and influence where the source of their fortune was never questioned. But the reckoning was approaching. Journalists were investigating. Prosecutors were asking questions. The DEA was building cases. The families of the dead were beginning to connect their losses to a common source. The wall of secrecy that had protected Purdue and the Sacklers was about to face its first serious test. By 2001, OxyContin was America's most abused drug. The Sacklers were becoming billionaires, and they were about to face their first real crisis. But what they did next proved they had learned nothing, or perhaps learned exactly the wrong lessons. In 2007, Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to federal felony charges for misbranding OxyContin. The punishment was a $600 million fine. The Sacklers' net worth at the time was approximately $14 billion. They didn't even notice. The federal investigation that led to this plea deal had begun 6 years earlier in an unlikely place. The office of a United States attorney in Western Virginia named John Brownlee. The region Brownlee oversaw had become one of the epicenters of the OxyContin epidemic. The coalfields of southwestern Virginia, just across the border from the devastated communities of eastern Kentucky, were experiencing a catastrophe that was impossible to ignore. Overdose deaths were climbing, crime rates were spiking, emergency rooms were overwhelmed, entire communities were being hollowed out by addiction. Local law enforcement, pharmacists and physicians had been raising alarms for years, but federal attention had been slow to arrive. Brownlee was a prosecutor, not a public health official, but the scale of the disaster in his jurisdiction demanded a response. In 2001, his office began examining whether Purdue Pharma had broken federal law in its marketing of OxyContin. What investigators found in Purdue's internal documents was damning beyond anything they had anticipated. The company had known about OxyContin's abuse potential from the beginning and had systematically lied about it to doctors, regulators, and the public. Emails between executives revealed detailed awareness of diversion and abuse patterns. One message discussed the street value of different OxyContin dosages, demonstrating that company officials understood their product had become a commodity in illegal drug markets. Another email chain showed executives debating how to respond to reports that OxyContin tablets were being crushed to defeat the time-release mechanism, with some officials arguing for formulation changes and others insisting that any acknowledgement of the problem would undermine marketing claims about the drug's safety. The marketing department won those debates. Sales reports from field representatives documented encounters with patients who were obviously addicted, who admitted to crushing and snorting pills, who showed signs of drug-seeking behavior. These reports went up the chain of command and disappeared into filing cabinets. Some were apparently destroyed. The representatives were not instructed to avoid such patients or to warn doctors about signs of abuse. They were instructed to keep selling. Memos documented Purdue's awareness that specific doctors were being investigated by state medical boards or the DEA for overprescribing, yet the company continued selling to these physicians and counting their prescriptions towards sales quotas. In some cases, Purdue representatives increased their visits to doctors under investigation, apparently viewing regulatory scrutiny as a signal that these were high-volume prescribers worth cultivating. The company had created systems to identify problematic prescribing and then used those systems to target rather than avoid the worst offenders. Perhaps most damning was the documentation of Purdue's claims about addiction rates. Investigators found internal communications showing that company scientists had questioned the less than 1% addiction claim years before the drug launched. They had pointed out that the evidence did not support such a specific number, and that the JIC letter being cited as proof was irrelevant to outpatient prescribing of sustained-release opioids. These concerns were overruled by the marketing executives, who understood that doctors needed a number, a statistic they could cite to reassure themselves and their patients that OxyContin was safe. The false claim remained in marketing materials for years, repeated by thousands of sales representatives to hundreds of thousands of physicians, shaping prescribing decisions that affected millions of patients. Armed with this evidence, Brownlee's office built a case for criminal charges. The legal theory was straightforward. Purdue had misbranded OxyContin by making false claims about its addiction potential, and this misbranding had been knowing and intentional rather than merely negligent. Federal law prohibited introducing misbranded drugs into interstate commerce, and violations could be prosecuted as felonies carrying significant prison time. The investigation took years, complicated by Purdue's aggressive legal defense and by questions about how high in the company the criminal liability extended. Brownlee wanted to charge individual executives, not just the corporation, believing that corporate fines alone were insufficient deterrent. He pushed to indict members of the Sackler family who had been involved in strategic decisions about OxyContin's marketing. But bringing charges against the Sacklers proved impossible. The family had structured their involvement in Purdue to maximize their control while minimizing their legal exposure. They sat on the board of directors and received regular briefings on company performance, but day-to-day decisions were made by hired executives whose signatures appeared on documents and whose emails discussed specific marketing tactics. These Sacklers could claim they had delegated operational authority and were not personally responsible for the actions of their employees. Whether this claim was accurate or merely a convenient legal fiction, it created enough ambiguity to make prosecution risky. Brownlee could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that specific Sackler family members had personally authorized specific misrepresentations. He could prove that the company had lied, but the company was an abstraction. Someone had to go to prison, or no one would. In the end, no one went to prison. After years of negotiation, Purdue Pharma agreed to plead guilty to felony misbranding, a serious charge that acknowledged the company had knowingly deceived doctors and the public about OxyContin's risks. 3 executives, including the president, chief medical officer, and general counsel, agreed to plead guilty to misdemeanor charges of misbranding. The misdemeanor pleas allowed them to avoid prison time while accepting some personal responsibility. The company would pay $600 million in fines and penalties. The settlement also included provisions that were supposed to prevent future misconduct. Purdue agreed to implement compliance programs and to actively monitor for signs of abuse and diversion. The company promised to report suspicious prescribing patterns to authorities rather than ignoring or exploiting them. It agreed to change its marketing practices and to stop making unsupported claims about addiction rates. If Purdue had honoured these commitments, the settlement might have represented a meaningful turning point. $600 million sounds like a lot of money. It was the largest fine ever paid by a pharmaceutical company at that time, and the announcement generated headlines suggesting that Purdue had been held accountable for its role in the opioid epidemic. But context matters. By 2007, OxyContin had generated cumulative revenues exceeding $20 billion. The Sackler family had extracted billions in dividends and other payments. The $600 million fine represented approximately 3% of total revenues, a modest cost of doing business that left the vast majority of profits untouched. A company considering whether to engage in illegal marketing could look at the Purdue settlement and conclude that the financial rewards of lawbreaking far exceeded the penalties for getting caught, and the individual consequences were even less impressive. The 3 executives who pleaded guilty to misdemeanors paid fines totaling approximately $34 million and were required to perform community service. They kept their freedom. They kept most of their wealth. Their careers were disrupted but not destroyed. For the thousands of people who had died from OxyContin overdoses, for the hundreds of thousands who had become addicted, for the communities that had been devastated, this was the accountability the American legal system provided. Fines paid by a corporation, misdemeanor pleas from executives who served no time, and a settlement agreement that would prove to be largely unenforceable. The Sackler family name appeared nowhere in the court proceedings. The indictments charged Purdue Pharma and its executives, but did not mention the owners who had built the company, approved its strategies, and collected its profits. Media coverage of the settlement focused on the corporation and the 3 executives who pleaded guilty. The Sacklers remained invisible, anonymous billionaires whose connection to OxyContin was known only to industry insiders and a handful of investigative journalists. This invisibility was not accidental. The Sacklers had spent decades cultivating a public image built on philanthropy rather than pharmaceuticals. Their names adorned museum wings and university buildings, but those names were associated with art and education, not with drugs. When people visited the Sackler wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, or the Sackler Gallery at the Smithsonian, they did not think about opioid addiction. They thought about cultural patronage. The family had purchased a form of reputation insurance, building up reserves of public goodwill that could absorb the reputational damage of any business scandal. The 2007 settlement depleted those reserves only slightly because most people never learned that the Sacklers had anything to do with OxyContin in the first place. The settlement also revealed something important about the relationship between Purdue and the regulatory system that was supposed to oversee it. John Brownlee later reported receiving a phone call from a senior Justice Department official on the evening before the settlement was to be announced. The official suggested that Brownlee might want to slow down the case, to consider whether the penalties were too harsh. Brownlee refused and proceeded with the announcement as planned. The official who made that call had connections to lawyers representing Purdue. The incident suggested that the company's influence extended into the highest levels of federal law enforcement, that even when prosecutors built airtight cases and secured guilty pleas, there were forces working to soften the consequences. What should have happened after the 2007 settlement was a fundamental change in how Purdue operated. The company had admitted to federal felonies. It had acknowledged that its marketing claims were false. It had promised to reform. A company genuinely chastened by criminal prosecution would have pulled back, would have implemented conservative prescribing guidelines, would have proactively identified and reported suspicious patterns, rather than waiting for regulators to act. That is not what happened. Instead, Purdue treated the settlement as a temporary setback, a tax on past behaviour rather than a constraint on future conduct. Within months of the guilty plea, the company was implementing new strategies to maintain and expand OxyContin sales. The compliance programs required by the settlement were created, but remained largely cosmetic. The monitoring systems for abuse and diversion generated reports that went unread or were used to refine marketing rather than to restrict distribution. The promise to stop deceptive marketing was interpreted so narrowly that virtually no changes were required. The family continued to collect profits, continued to expand their philanthropy, continued to live as though nothing had happened. The 2007 settlement should have been the end. It was designed to be the end, a resolution that would allow everyone to move on while providing the appearance of accountability. Prosecutors could claim victory, Purdue could claim reform, the Sacklers could claim innocence. The dead could not claim anything, but their families were offered no voice in the proceedings and no compensation for their losses. Instead, the settlement became proof that there were no consequences the Sacklers could not buy their way out of. They had paid 3% of their profits and kept the other 97%. They had watched 3 executives accept responsibility while the family itself remained untouched. They had learned that the American legal system would bend rather than break when confronted with sufficient wealth and legal firepower. The lesson they drew from this experience was not that they should change their behaviour. The lesson was that they could survive anything. Here is what nobody understood at the time. The Sacklers were not retreating, they were reloading. The settlement freed them to implement an even more aggressive strategy, one that would learn from past mistakes while doubling down on the fundamental business model that had made OxyContin so profitable. The domestic market was becoming more difficult as public awareness grew and regulatory scrutiny increased. But there was a whole world out there, billions of people who had never heard of the opioid epidemic, whose doctors had never been warned about OxyContin's risks, whose governments had not yet built defences against pharmaceutical marketing. And even in America, there were still opportunities. The settlement restricted certain marketing practices, but it did not restrict the drug itself. OxyContin remained on the market, fully approved by the FDA, available to any doctor, willing to prescribe it. The Sacklers had a new market in mind, and this time it would be everyone. After pleading guilty to federal felonies, most companies would change. Purdue Pharma got more aggressive. They had a secret project code named Tango. Its goal was to expand OxyContin worldwide, while the lawsuits piled up in America. The years following the 2007 settlement should have been a period of contrition and reform. Instead, they became the most ambitious phase of Purdue's expansion, a doubling down on the strategies that had already killed tens of thousands of Americans. The company had learned from its criminal prosecution, but the lessons it drew were not the ones prosecutors intended. Purdue learned that fines were manageable, that prison was avoidable, that the American legal system could be navigated with sufficient resources and legal talent. Armed with this knowledge, the Sacklers and their executives set out to replicate the OxyContin success story on a global scale before domestic conditions made their business model impossible. Project Tango was the internal name for Purdue's international expansion initiative. Documents that would later emerge through litigation revealed a comprehensive plan to bring OxyContin and related opioid products to markets in Latin America, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. The strategy drew explicitly on the lessons learned in the United States, adapting the marketing playbook to local conditions while retaining the core elements that had proven so effective, targeting general practitioners rather than specialists, funding patient advocacy groups to promote aggressive pain treatment, cultivating key opinion leaders through paid consulting arrangements, and emphasizing the supposed safety advantages of sustained release formulations. The internal documents were remarkably candid about the opportunity. Executives noted that international markets were essentially where the United States had been in the mid-1990s, underserved by opioid manufacturers, populated by doctors who'd been taught to fear addiction, free it for a campaign to change attitudes about pain treatment. The regulatory environments in many target countries were less sophisticated than in the United States, with fewer resources for monitoring prescription drug abuse and less developed systems for tracking diversion. Cultural attitudes toward pharmaceutical marketing were often more permissive. The conditions that had allowed OxyContin to flourish in America could be recreated elsewhere, potentially on an even larger scale. Purdue established international subsidiaries and partnerships to execute this strategy. Mundi Pharma, a network of associated companies controlled by the Sackler family, became the primary vehicle for international expansion. Mundi Pharma operated in over 120 countries and employed thousands of sales representatives. The company used marketing materials that were strikingly similar to those that had been discredited in the United States, making claims about addiction risk that American prosecutors had already determined to be fraudulent. When journalists and public health officials raised concerns about Mundi Pharma exporting the opioid epidemic, the company insisted that it was operating independently from Purdue and that international markets were different from the United States. But the ownership was the same. The Sackler family controlled both Purdue and Mundi Pharma, and profits from both flowed to the same accounts. While pursuing international expansion, Purdue also worked to protect its domestic market through a reformulation strategy that revealed the company's priorities with brutal clarity. In 2010, the FDA approved a new version of OxyContin with an abuse deterrent formulation. The reformulated pills contained polymers that made them more difficult to crush into powder for snorting or dissolve for injection. Purdue marketed this change as evidence of its commitment to addressing the addiction crisis, presenting the new formulation as a breakthrough in preventing abuse. The reality was more complicated. The abuse deterrent formulation did make OxyContin somewhat harder to misuse, but it did not make the drug less addictive when taken as prescribed. Patients who swallowed the pills whole still developed physical dependence. The reformulation addressed only the most dramatic forms of abuse, while leaving the fundamental addiction problem untouched. More troubling was how Purdue managed the transition between formulations. When the new version was approved, the company did not immediately withdraw the old easily abused pills from the market. Instead, Purdue continued selling the original formulation for months, citing manufacturing transition requirements. During this period, millions of pills that the company knew were being crushed, snorted, and injected continued to flow into communities already devastated by addiction. The delay was not accidental. Every month of continued sales of the old formulation generated revenue, while the new version ramped up production. Purdue was maximizing the value of a product it had acknowledged was being widely abused. The introduction of abuse deterrent. OxyContin created an unintended consequence that Purdue tracked through market research but did nothing to address. People who had become addicted to OxyContin and could no longer easily abuse the new pills began switching to heroin. The phenomenon was well documented. Researchers found that the reformulation was associated with a sharp increase in heroin initiation among people who had previously abused prescription opioids. The timing was unmistakable. Heroin use spiked almost immediately after abuse deterrent. OxyContin reached the market. Purdue was aware of this transition. Internal documents show that the company conducted market research tracking what happened to users who could no longer easily abuse OxyContin. The research showed exactly what public health officials feared: a migration to heroin and later to illicit fentanyl. Purdue's response was not to warn doctors, not to fund addiction treatment, not to support harm reduction measures. The company simply documented the phenomenon and continued operating as before. In a very real sense, Purdue had created the customer base that Mexican drug cartels would later exploit. The years of aggressive OxyContin marketing had produced millions of Americans with opioid addiction. When the pharmaceutical supply became harder to abuse, those addicts turned to the illegal market. The heroin epidemic that would kill tens of thousands was a direct consequence of the prescription opioid epidemic that Purdue had created. The company that started the fire expressed no responsibility for where the flames spread. Purdue's behavior during this period extended beyond simply selling drugs into actively undermining efforts to address the crisis it had created. The company and its allies in the pharmaceutical industry lobbied against measures that would have saved lives. One target was naloxone, the overdose reversal drug that could bring people back from the brink of death. Public health advocates pushed to make naloxone available over the counter and to equip first responders with the medication. Opioid manufacturers, including Purdue, worked to slow these efforts, funding studies questioning whether broad naloxone availability might encourage drug use, and supporting policy positions that kept the antidote less accessible than it could have been. The logic was perverse. A company profiting from addiction was working to limit access to a medication that could prevent its customers from dying. Purdue also funded a network of patient advocacy groups that served as front organizations for pharmaceutical interests. Groups with names suggesting grassroots patient activism received millions of dollars from opioid manufacturers and used that money to promote more aggressive pain treatment. These groups published materials arguing that concerns about opioid addiction were overblown, that patients were suffering because doctors were too conservative with prescriptions, that the real crisis was undertreated pain rather than overprescribed opioids. They attacked journalists investigating the epidemic accusing them of stigmatizing pain patients and perpetuating myths about addiction. They targeted physicians who advocated for more cautious prescribing, portraying them as enemies of patients in pain. The American Pain Foundation was perhaps the most prominent of these groups. It received over 90% of its funding from pharmaceutical companies and used that money to lobby against prescribing restrictions while promoting opioid therapy. When congressional investigators began examining the organization's finances and activities, the American Pain Foundation abruptly shut down in 2012 rather than face scrutiny. But others continued operating, maintaining the fiction of patient advocacy while serving pharmaceutical interests. Throughout this period, the Sackler family remained deeply involved in Perdue's strategy. Richard Sackler, the son of Raymond Sackler and a board member with significant operational influence, was particularly active. Emails obtained through litigation revealed his direct engagement with marketing decisions, his views on the addiction crisis, and his approach to managing the company's public relations challenges. These emails are remarkable documents, windows into the psychology of a family that had built a fortune on addiction while convincing themselves they bore no responsibility for the consequences. In one email from 2001, as reports of OxyContin abuse were mounting, Richard Sackler wrote that the company needed to hammer on the abusers in every way possible. "They are the culprits and the problem," he wrote. "They are reckless criminals." The framing was revealing. In Richard Sackler's mind, the people dying from OxyContin were not victims of deceptive marketing or inadequate warnings. They were not patients who had trusted their doctors and become inadvertently addicted. They were criminals whose reckless behavior had nothing to do with Perdue or the Sackler family. This was not a momentary lapse, but a consistent worldview. Other emails showed Richard Sackler directing publicity strategies to shift blame away from the company, emphasizing the distinction between legitimate patients and criminal abusers, and treating addiction as a character flaw rather than a medical condition or a consequence of Perdue's business practices. The family that had built a company on the claim that addiction was rare and that OxyContin was safe responded to mounting evidence of mass addiction by insisting that the addicts were simply bad people who deserved whatever happened to them. The Sacklers apparently never considered the possibility that a company which had lied about addiction risk might bear responsibility when addiction predictably followed. They never acknowledged that the doctors they had trained to prescribe aggressively were following Perdue's instructions. They never connected the marketing campaign celebrating more liberal opioid use to the millions of Americans who had taken that advice and become dependent. In their minds, the Sacklers were victims of their own success, innovators whose breakthrough pain medication had been hijacked by criminals. The numbers by 2015 were catastrophic. More than 200,000 Americans had died from opioid overdoses since OxyContin launched, with the annual death toll climbing year after year. OxyContin itself had been directly implicated in an estimated 70 to 100,000 of those deaths, though the true figure was certainly higher because many death certificates listed opioid overdose without specifying which opioid. The broader epidemic that OxyContin had ignited, first through prescription painkillers and then through the heroin and fentanyl that addicted patients turned to, was killing more than 30,000 Americans annually by 2015, more than car accidents, more than gun violence, more than AIDS at its peak in the 90s. Entire generations in certain communities were being hollowed out. Children were growing up in foster care because their parents had died or become unable to function. The opioid epidemic had become the deadliest drug crisis in American history, and it showed no signs of slowing down. OxyContin sales had reached $2.8 billion in 2012, and while revenues declined somewhat in subsequent years as generic competition increased and prescribing guidelines tightened, Perdue remained enormously profitable. The Sacklers had extracted billions from the company over the years, building a family fortune estimated at $14 billion. They continued their philanthropy, continued seeing their names on museum wings and university buildings, continued moving in social circles where their connection to OxyContin was either unknown or politely ignored. But something had changed. Journalists were investigating more aggressively. Patrick Radden Keefe published a landmark article in The New Yorker laying out the Sackler family's role in the opioid crisis. Lawsuits were multiplying, and discovery in those cases was producing documents that revealed the inner workings of Perdue and the family's involvement. State attorneys general were coordinating investigations. The wall of secrecy and respectability that had protected the Sacklers for decades was beginning to crack. By 2015, the opioid crisis was killing more Americans than AIDS at its peak. The Sacklers were worth $14 billion. But people were starting to say their name. The Sackler name is on the walls of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Louvre, the Tate, the Guggenheim, Harvard, Yale, Oxford, and Cambridge. The question is why? Not why a wealthy family would donate to prestigious institutions that is common enough among the rich, but why the Sacklers pursued cultural philanthropy with such singular focus, such strategic precision, such apparent understanding that their donations were purchasing something far more valuable than naming rights. The answer lies in recognizing that Sackler philanthropy was never primarily about generosity or cultural appreciation. It was a business strategy, a form of reputation insurance that Arthur Sackler pioneered in the 1960s and that his family perfected over the following decades. The Sacklers didn't just buy art, they bought immunity, and for more than half a century, that investment paid extraordinary dividends. Arthur Sackler began building the philanthropic infrastructure in the mid-1960s, just as his pharmaceutical advertising empire was generating enormous profits. His first major donation was to the Smithsonian Institution, where he funded what would become the Arthur M. Sackler Gallery of Asian Art. The gift established a pattern that would define Sackler philanthropy for generations: give to institutions with unimpeachable prestige, insist on prominent naming rights, and cultivate relationships with institutional leadership that would create lasting bonds of mutual obligation. Arthur understood something crucial about the psychology of institutional giving. When your name appears on a museum wing or a university building, you become part of that institution's identity. The institution's reputation becomes intertwined with your own. Criticizing you becomes in some subtle way criticizing the institution itself. Administrators who accepted your money have a personal stake in defending your reputation, because any taint on your name reflects on their judgment in accepting your gift. The more prestigious the institution, the more powerful this protective effect becomes. Arthur did not choose his beneficiaries randomly. He gave to the most elite cultural and educational institutions in the world, places whose names carried such weight that association with them conferred automatic respectability. The Metropolitan Museum of Art received gifts that funded the Sackler wing, home to the Temple of Dender, one of the museum's most popular attractions. Harvard received donations that established the Arthur M. Sackler Museum. The Smithsonian, the Tate Gallery in London, the Louvre in Paris, the Royal Academy of Arts, the Guggenheim, Oxford University, Cambridge University, Columbia, Cornell, Tufts, the list grew and grew. By the time Arthur died, in 1987, the Sackler name was inscribed on walls across 3 continents. His brothers Mortimer and Raymond continued and expanded this strategy after his death. The family gave tens of millions to the institutions Arthur had cultivated while adding new beneficiaries. Medical schools received particular attention, which served the dual purpose of burnishing the family's reputation and maintaining relationships with the academic physicians who shaped prescribing practices. The Sackler family funded research centers, endowed professorships, and supported medical education programs. Doctors trained in Sackler funded facilities, studying under Sackler-endowed professors, absorbing Sackler-funded research, entered practice predisposed to view the family as benefactors of medicine rather than as pharmaceutical profiteers. The scale of Sackler giving was enormous, but difficult to track precisely because much of it flowed through family foundations with limited disclosure requirements. Estimates suggest the family gave away hundreds of millions of dollars over several decades, perhaps as much as $1 billion. These sums purchased a web of relationships and obligations that extended through the upper reaches of American and European cultural and academic life. Museum directors attended Sackler family events. University presidents sent thank you notes and named buildings. Hospital administrators cultivated relationships in hopes of future gifts. An entire ecosystem of elite institutions had financial ties to the Sackler family, and those ties created powerful incentives to avoid asking uncomfortable questions about where the money came from. The immunity effect was real and measurable. Journalists who began investigating the Sacklers in the early 2000s found doors closing in their faces. Institutions declined to comment on their Sackler relationships. Academics who might have provided expert analysis were reluctant to criticize a family that funded their colleagues' research. Museum curators who knew perfectly well that OxyContin had generated the Sackler fortune treated any suggestion that this was problematic as a form of philistinism, a failure to appreciate that art and commerce operated in separate spheres. The journalists who persisted faced subtle and not so subtle pressure. Editors received calls from Sackler representatives suggesting that stories were unfair or unbalanced. Public relations firms deployed by the family worked to shape coverage and minimize damage. The wall of institutional protection surrounding the Sacklers was not impenetrable, but it was formidable enough to slow the flow of critical coverage for years. The breaking of that wall began with an unlikely figure, a photographer named Nan Goldin, who had nearly died from OxyContin addiction. Goldin was a celebrated artist whose work hung in many of the same museums that bore the Sackler name. She had been prescribed OxyContin for surgery and had become addicted within days, eventually progressing to heroin before entering recovery. Unlike most addiction survivors, Goldin had a platform. She had connections in the art world. She understood how cultural institutions operated and how philanthropy created networks of obligation. And she was furious. In 2017, Goldin founded an organization called Prescription Addiction Intervention Now, using the acronym PAIN as a deliberate provocation. The group began staging protests at museums that had accepted Sackler money. At the Guggenheim, activists threw pill bottles into the museum's famous rotunda, while Goldin read the names of opioid overdose victims. At the Metropolitan Museum, protesters gathered in the Sackler wing shouting "Shame on Sackler" and draping banners over the balconies. At the Harvard Art Museums, at the Victoria and Albert in London, at the Louvre in Paris, the protests spread. Goldin's campaign was brilliant precisely because it targeted the immunity that Sackler Philanthropy had purchased. By staging protests inside museums, she forced institutions to choose between their donors and their values. By recruiting artists and cultural figures to support peer pain, she created counterpressure within the art world. By generating media coverage that explicitly linked the Sackler name to the opioid epidemic, she broke through the wall of polite silence that had protected the family for decades. Museum visitors who had walked through the Sackler wing without a second thought were now confronted with the question of what that name represented. The institutional response was initially defensive. Museum directors issued statements expressing sympathy for addiction victims while noting that the Sacklers had been generous supporters of the arts. They pointed out that accepting donations did not constitute endorsement of donors' business practices. They suggested that removing the Sackler name would not bring back the dead or address the opioid crisis, but the pressure continued to build, and one by one the dominoes began to fall. The National Portrait Gallery in London announced in 2010 that it would no longer accept donations from the Sackler family. The Tate Museums followed, then the Guggenheim, then the South London Gallery. The Metropolitan Museum announced that it would no longer accept gifts from Sacklers associated with Purdue Pharma, a careful distinction that still accepted money from descendants of Arthur Sackler, while rejecting funds from Mortimer and Raymond's branches. The Louvre quietly removed the Sackler name from its wing of Oriental antiquities. Universities followed museums. The decision to refuse future Sackler money implied that previous Sackler money had been somehow tainted, which implied that the institutions had been wrong to accept it in the first place. The reputational armour that generations of philanthropy had built was cracking. The Sackler name that had once opened every door in elite culture was becoming toxic. This unravelling revealed an uncomfortable truth about institutional philanthropy that extended far beyond the Sackler family. The system that allowed wealthy donors to purchase naming rights and cultivate protective relationships with prestigious institutions was inherently corrupting. It created incentives for institutions to avoid scrutinizing their donors too carefully, to ask few questions about the sources of wealth, to provide cover for reputations that might not survive examination. The Sacklers exploited this system more successfully than most, but they did not create it. The museums and universities that accepted Sackler money were following standard practice. The fact that standard practice had allowed a family that profited from mass addiction to purchase decades of respectability suggested that the practice itself was problematic. The reckoning with Sackler philanthropy raised a final uncomfortable question about Arthur Sackler specifically. Arthur's heirs had long insisted that he bore no responsibility for the opioid epidemic. He had died in 1987 before OxyContin existed. His wealth came from advertising and art collecting, not from opioid sales. His descendants formed a separate branch of the family that had sold their stake in Purdue decades before OxyContin launched. They argued that linking Arthur to the epidemic was guilt by association, punishing children and grandchildren for the sins of their uncles and cousins. The argument was legally accurate, but morally incomplete. Arthur Sackler did not profit from OxyContin directly, but Arthur Sackler created the marketing techniques that made OxyContin possible. He pioneered the strategy of selling diseases rather than just drugs. He developed the system of paid key opinion leaders and ghost-written research that manufactured scientific consensus. He demonstrated that doctors could be programmed through sophisticated advertising disguised as education. He proved that pharmaceutical companies could create blockbuster drugs not through better chemistry but through better psychology. Every element of the OxyContin marketing playbook came from Arthur Sackler's innovations. His brothers applied his techniques to a more dangerous product, but the techniques were his. The machine he built to sell Valium was repurposed to sell OxyContin. The strategies he developed to normalize tranquilizer use for everyday anxiety were adapted to normalize opioid use for everyday pain. Arthur Sackler was not innocent of the opioid epidemic. He was its architect in a profound sense, the man who invented the methods that made mass pharmaceutical addiction possible. Arthur also pioneered the philanthropic strategy that protected the family from accountability. His gifts to the Smithsonian and Harvard established the model his brothers would follow. His cultivation of relationships with cultural and academic institutions created the playbook for reputation laundering. His understanding that prestige could be purchased and deployed as a shield demonstrated how wealthy families could protect themselves from the consequences of their business activities. Arthur did not profit from OxyContin, but OxyContin profited from everything Arthur had built. The Sacklers understood something profound about American society. Institutions that depend on donations will protect their donors. Wealth can purchase not just comfort and influence, but a form of immunity from criticism, a presumption of respectability that persists until the evidence of wrongdoing becomes so overwhelming that it can no longer be ignored. The Sacklers bought that immunity through decades of strategic giving, and it served them well for half a century. By the time the immunity cracked, the family had extracted billions from OxyContin and distributed much of that wealth beyond the reach of creditors. The protests at the Met came too late to prevent the epidemic. The removal of the Sackler name came too late to undo the damage. The institutions that finally refused Sackler money had been accepting it for decades while the bodies piled up. The reckoning with Sackler philanthropy was real, but it was also a reckoning deferred until the protective value of the Sackler name had already been exhausted. But even $35 billion cannot buy silence forever. The lawsuits were coming, thousands of them, from states and cities and tribes and hospitals and individuals who had lost everything to the drug the Sacklers had promoted. For the first time, the Sackler name would be spoken in courtrooms across America, and the documents that emerged would reveal exactly what the family had known and when they had known it. In 2019, Purdue Pharma filed for bankruptcy. This was not defeat, this was the plan. The bankruptcy filing represented the culmination of years of strategic preparation by the Sackler family, a carefully orchestrated legal maneuver designed to shield their personal wealth from the thousands of lawsuits threatening to hold them accountable for the opioid epidemic. By the time the company entered bankruptcy court, the Sacklers had already extracted most of the value from Purdue, leaving behind a corporate shell that could absorb the legal liability while the family fortune remained largely intact. The path to bankruptcy began with a tsunami of litigation. By 2010, more than 2,600 lawsuits had been filed against Purdue Pharma, and the number was growing daily. Every state attorney general in the country had either sued or was investigating the company. Hundreds of cities and counties had filed claims seeking compensation for the costs of addiction treatment, emergency services, foster care for children of addicted parents, and countless other expenses the epidemic had imposed on local governments. Native American tribes sued, arguing that their communities had been disproportionately devastated. Hospitals sued for unreimbursed treatment costs. Individuals who had become addicted or lost family members to overdose filed wrongful death and personal injury claims. The evidence emerging through discovery in these cases was devastating. Internal documents showed that Purdue had known about widespread OxyContin abuse years before acknowledging it publicly. Emails revealed executives discussing strategies to deflect blame and maintain sales, despite mounting reports of addiction and death. Marketing materials demonstrated the systematic deception of doctors and patients. The paper trail proved what prosecutors and journalists had suspected for years. The Sacklers and their company had prioritized profits over lives with full knowledge of the consequences. Against this backdrop of overwhelming evidence and multiplying lawsuits, the Sacklers executed a financial strategy that would later become central to the bankruptcy proceedings. Between 2007 and 2018, the family extracted an estimated $10.7 billion from Purdue Pharma through dividends, payments, and other distributions. This money flowed through a complex network of trusts, holding companies, and offshore accounts designed to place it beyond the reach of creditors and courts. Family members transferred assets to entities in jurisdictions with strong secrecy protections. They moved money through layers of corporate structures that obscured ownership and complicated any attempt to trace the funds. They distributed wealth to younger generations, creating legal separation between the family, members who had directed Perdue's strategy, and the assets that might otherwise be seized to pay judgments. The timing of these transfers was not coincidental. As litigation pressure increased, the pace of extraction accelerated. The family was racing to move money out of Perdue before courts could freeze assets or impose liability. By the time the company filed for bankruptcy, it had been substantially hollowed out. The entity that would face creditors in bankruptcy court was far less valuable than the sum of distributions the Sacklers had already received. The bankruptcy filing itself was a strategic masterstroke. Under American bankruptcy law, when a company enters Chapter 11 protection, all pending litigation against it is automatically stayed. Creditors cannot continue pursuing their claims in court. Instead, all claims are consolidated into the bankruptcy proceeding, where they are addressed through a unified process overseen by a bankruptcy judge. For a company facing thousands of separate lawsuits in jurisdictions across the country, bankruptcy offered an escape from the chaos of decentralized litigation and a chance to resolve everything in a single negotiation. But the Sacklers wanted more than consolidation. They wanted immunity. The family's lawyers proposed a settlement structure in which Perdue would be dissolved and its assets distributed to creditors, while the Sacklers personally would contribute several $billion over time. In exchange for this contribution, all claims against family members would be released, permanently and completely. No individual Sackler could ever be sued for their role in the opioid epidemic. No future plaintiff could pursue them for wrongful death or fraud or conspiracy. The payment would purchase not just resolution of existing claim, but immunity from any claims that might ever arise. The initial offer was approximately $4.5 billion to be paid over a decade. The Sacklers framed this as an enormous sacrifice, a contribution that would substantially reduce the family fortune for the benefit of communities devastated by opioids. Their lawyers argued that without the immunity provision, the family would not agree to any settlement, and years of additional litigation would delay compensation to victim while enriching lawyers. The choice they presented was stark: accept the deal with immunity and receive billions relatively quickly, or reject immunity and spend decades fighting in court while the Sacklers used their resources to delay and obstruct. The proposal provoked outrage from state attorneys general, addiction advocates, and families of overdose victims. Critics argued that the Sacklers were using bankruptcy law to achieve something that should be impossible: escaping personal liability for conduct that would normally expose them to unlimited damages. The family had not filed for personal bankruptcy. They remained individually wealthy, capable of paying far more than their sons were offering. Yet they were seeking to use the corporate bankruptcy of Perdue as a shield for their personal assets. The immunity provision was particularly galling because it would be granted without any finding of personal wrongdoing. The Sacklers would not have to admit that they had done anything wrong. They would not face criminal charges. They would simply pay money and walk away, their legal exposure eliminated by judicial order. Several state attorneys general announced they would oppose the settlement and fight the immunity provision in court. The legal battle over Sackler immunity played out over several years and involved unprecedented questions about the limits of bankruptcy law. Could a bankruptcy court release claims against non-debtors who had not themselves filed for the bankruptcy? Could wealthy individuals purchase immunity from mass tort claims by contributing to a corporate bankruptcy settlement? The questions divided legal scholars and produced conflicting rulings from different courts. A bankruptcy judge initially approved a settlement that included Sackler immunity, finding that the provision was necessary to achieve a workable resolution and that the alternatives were worse for creditors. But a federal district court reversed that ruling, holding that the bankruptcy code did not authorize releasing claims against parties who had not consented to bankruptcy jurisdiction. Though the Sacklers appealed to the Supreme Court, which agreed to hear the case in a decision that suggested the justices had serious concerns about the use of bankruptcy to shield wealthy individuals from accountability. The legal uncertainty created leverage for renewed negotiations. The Sacklers eventually agreed to increase their contribution to approximately $6 billion, still paid over time but substantially more than their original offer. They also agreed to additional conditions, including acknowledgements of wrongdoing that stopped short of formal legal admissions but went further than their previous public statements. The family would acknowledge that Purdue had engaged in conduct that contributed to the opioid crisis and that they bore responsibility for the company's actions during their tenure as owners and directors. As part of the settlement, the Sacklers agreed to have their name removed from institutions that had been funded with Purdue money. This provision was largely symbolic since the family had already become toxic to cultural institutions and most had stopped accepting Sackler donations years earlier, but it formalized the reputational consequences the family had resisted acknowledging. The Sackler name would be stripped from buildings and programs associated with Purdue Pharma, though it would remain on countless museums, universities and hospitals that had received donations before the opioid epidemic became public knowledge. The final settlement resolved the bankruptcy in 2022, though appeals and implementation continued afterward. Purdue Pharma was dissolved. Its assets were distributed to a fund that would compensate states, cities, tribes, and other claimants. The opioid treatment medications that Purdue had developed would be made available at reduced cost to support addiction recovery. The Sacklers would pay their $6 billion over time, and in exchange would receive releases from civil liability, though the releases were structured more narrowly than the family had originally sought following the Supreme Court's intervention. The settlement allowed victims and their families to receive compensation, though the amounts were modest given the scale of the epidemic. Individual claimants who had lost family members to overdose or struggled with addiction themselves received payments that rarely exceeded a few $1,000s. The states and municipalities received larger allocations, but even these fell far short of the actual costs the opioid crisis had imposed. The settlement was better than nothing, which was the alternative the Sacklers had effectively presented, but it was not justice by any reasonable definition. The math tells the story. The Sackler family at its peak was worth approximately $14 billion. They extracted an estimated $10.7 billion from Purdue before bankruptcy. They agreed to pay approximately $6 billion in the settlement, spread over years and structured in ways that minimized immediate impact on the family wealth. After everything, the Sacklers retained an estimated $6 to $10 billion, enough to ensure that generations of family members would live in extraordinary luxury indefinitely. Meanwhile, the opioid epidemic they had helped create had killed more than 500,000 Americans between 1999 and 2022. If you attribute even 200,000 of those deaths specifically to OxyContin and the prescription opioid crisis it spawned, the settlement works out to roughly $12,000 per death. That is less than the cost of a funeral. The Sacklers paid less per body than it cost to bury one. No family member went to prison. No family member was convicted of any crime. No family member faced meaningful restrictions on their freedom or their future opportunities. The acknowledgements of wrongdoing included in the settlement were carefully worded to avoid language that could support criminal prosecution. The Sacklers admitted that bad things had happened while they controlled Purdue, but stopped short of admitting that they personally had done those bad things, or that they had intended the consequences that followed. The settlement preserved the fiction that had protected them throughout. The company was responsible, the executives were responsible, the doctors were responsible, the addicts were responsible, but the owners who built the company, hired the executives, funded the marketing and collected the profits, bore no personal culpability. The system that enabled this outcome remains intact. Wealthy individuals can still use bankruptcy law to shield assets from creditors. Pharmaceutical companies can still pay fines that amount to small fractions of their profits from illegal conduct. Corporate structures can still separate ownership from liability, allowing families to extract wealth while leaving corporate shells to absorb legal consequences. The Sackler bankruptcy was not an aberration in the American legal system. It was the system working as designed, protecting capital from accountability, ensuring that wealth once accumulated cannot easily be reclaimed, regardless of how it was obtained. The opioid epidemic continues. More than 100,000 Americans now die from drug overdoses every year, more than double the rate when OxyContin was at its peak. Fentanyl has replaced prescription opioids as the primary killer, but the addiction crisis the Sacklers helped create provided the customer base that illegal fentanyl now serves. The people who became addicted to OxyContin in the early 2000s progressed through heroin to fentanyl. The communities devastated by pharmaceutical opioids became the communities devastated by illegal opioids. The epidemic changed form but did not end, and the Sacklers bear responsibility for starting it even if they are not responsible for where it went after they lost control. Here is what nobody talks about. The Sacklers did not just survive, they thrived. They emerged from the largest public health catastrophe in American history with billions of dollars, comfortable lives, and futures unburdened by any legal consequence more serious than the embarrassment of having their name removed from museum walls. Their children and their grandchildren will inherit fortunes built on the bodies of 500,000 dead Americans. They will attend elite universities, collect art, fund philanthropies, and move through the world with all the privileges that wealth provides. The system that protected them remains intact, ready to protect the next family that discovers how to monetize mass suffering while maintaining plausible deniability. The Sacklers proved something important about American society. There is no amount of death you can cause, no depth of suffering you can inflict that money cannot ultimately resolve. Justice in America has a price, and if you can pay it, justice does not apply to you. How do you remember a family that killed more Americans than the Vietnam War, paid a fraction of their profits in fines, and still has their name on the walls of the world's greatest museums? This question has no satisfying answer because the American system that enabled the Sacklers provides no framework for genuine accountability when the perpetrators are sufficiently wealthy. The opioid epidemic they ignited continues to burn through communities across the country, killing more than 100,000 people per year, destroying families, overwhelming emergency services, filling foster care systems with children whose parents cannot care for them. The crisis has evolved since OxyContin was at its peak, shifting from prescription pills to heroin to illicit fentanyl, but each stage built upon the foundation the Sacklers laid. They did not create fentanyl, and they do not control the Mexican cartels that now supply most of America's illegal opioids, but they created the market. They manufactured millions of addicts through aggressive marketing of a drug they knew to be dangerous. They established the customer base that illegal suppliers now service. Every fentanyl death traces back through heroin, through diverted pills, through legitimate prescriptions that created dependence, to the decisions made in Purdue Pharma boardrooms where Sackler family members approved strategies designed to maximize prescribing regardless of consequences. The comparison to historical drug empires is instructive. The Sassoon family, the subject of countless documentaries and books about colonial exploitation, controlled perhaps 70% of the opium trade into China at their peak in the 19th century. Their business contributed to addiction affecting an estimated 10 to 15% of the Chinese population, weakening the nation, draining its silver reserves, precipitating wars and political collapse. The Sassoons operated with the protection of the British Empire, using gunboats to enforce their access to Chinese markets and military power to punish any attempt to restrict the trade. They were called the Rothschilds of the East, and their legacy is remembered as one of history's great examples of commercial exploitation causing mass human suffering. The Sacklers operated in a different context but achieved comparable results. The American opioid epidemic has killed more than 500,000 people since 1999 and continues killing at rates exceeding 100,000 annually. The United States population is roughly 330 million, meaning the annual death toll represents about 1 in every 3,300 Americans. Extrapolated over the duration of the crisis, the cumulative impact approaches the proportional devastation the Sassoons inflicted on China. The Sacklers did not need gunboats because they had something more effective: regulatory capture, political influence, and a legal system designed to protect capital from consequences. The British Empire enforced the opium trade through military violence. The American pharmaceutical industry enforces its prerogatives through lobbying, campaign contributions, and an army of lawyers who ensure that any accountability comes slowly, partially, and at a price the industry can afford to pay. The system that produced the opioid epidemic remains fundamentally unchanged. Pharmaceutical companies still market drugs aggressively to doctors, still fund research that supports their products, still cultivate key opinion leaders who serve as paid advocates, still deploy the sales forces incentivized to maximize prescriptions regardless of appropriateness. The FDA still relies heavily on industry-funded studies for drug approval decisions. Regulators still move through revolving doors between government agencies and the companies they oversee. Wealthy individuals still structure their assets to place them beyond the reach of creditors and courts. Corporate bankruptcy still allows owners to extract value while leaving shells to absorb liability. Nothing that happened to the Sacklers has changed the fundamental incentives that made their business model so profitable. The fine they paid, the settlement they reached, the reputational damage they suffered, None of it was sufficient to deter future actors from pursuing similar strategies. The next pharmaceutical company that discovers it can make billions by overstating a drug's safety and understating its risks will face the same cost-benefit calculation the Sacklers faced, and that calculation still favours aggressive marketing over caution. The expected penalties are still small relative to the expected profits. The probability of personal accountability for executives and owners is still negligible. The Sacklers themselves have largely disappeared from public view. Family members who were once fixtures of high society, attending galas and sitting on museum boards and mixing with cultural elites, have retreated into privacy. Some have reportedly changed their names or used maternal surnames to distance themselves from the Sackler legacy. They no longer give interviews or make public appearances. Their philanthropy, once deployed to purchase respectability, has become impossible as institutions refuse to accept their money and remove their names from existing donations. But privacy is not punishment, and anonymity is not accountability. The Sacklers remain among the wealthiest families in America, with assets estimated between $6 and $10 billion, depending on how their trusts and holdings are valued. Their children attend elite private schools and universities. Their grandchildren will never want for anything. They own properties in Manhattan and the Hamptons and London and elsewhere. They collect art, they travel freely, they live lives of extraordinary privilege financed by the suffering of millions. No Sackler family member has served a single day in prison. None has been convicted of any crime. None has been meaningfully restricted in their freedom or their opportunities. The worst consequence any of them has faced is social awkwardness, the discomfort of being recognized at parties or having their donations rejected by institutions that once welcomed them. This is what passes for accountability in America when the defendants are sufficiently wealthy. The historical record is unambiguous in a way that distinguishes the Sacklers from many corporate villains. The Sassoons could plausibly claim ignorance of some of their trade's effects. 19th century understanding of addiction was limited. The consequences of opium use played out across vast distances, in Chinese villages far removed from Sassoon counting houses in Bombay and Shanghai. The Sacklers enjoy no such excuse. Internal documents produced through litigation reveal that they knew exactly what they were doing. Emails show family members discussing abuse reports and strategizing about how to deflect blame. Memos show executives acknowledging that OxyContin was being crushed and snorted while recommending against formulation changes that might reduce profits. Sales reports show the company tracking regions with explosive growth in prescriptions alongside explosive growth in addiction and death. The Sacklers had access to data showing the correlation between their marketing efforts and the mortality rates in targeted communities. They pushed harder anyway. The documentary record is so complete and so damning that the Sacklers cannot retreat into the comfortable ambiguity that protects most corporate wrongdoers. They cannot claim they were misled by subordinates or acting on incomplete information. They cannot argue that the consequences were unforeseeable or that they responded appropriately once problems emerged. Every defense has been foreclosed by their own words, preserved in corporate archives and produced through discovery. History will record not just what the Sacklers did, but that they understood what they were doing and chose to continue because the profits were too attractive to forego. The Sassoons were called the Rothschilds of the East. What do we call the Sacklers? The Sassoons of America seems apt given the parallels between the opium trade and the opioid epidemic. The philanthropic cartel captures their strategy of using charitable giving to purchase respectability and immunity from criticism. But perhaps the simplest description is the most accurate. The family that proved in America, if you're rich enough, you can kill hundreds of thousands of people and walk away with billions of dollars. The Sacklers tested the limits of American accountability and found that there were no limits, only prices, and that any price can be paid if your fortune is large enough. They demonstrated that wealth provides not just comfort and influence, but a form of legal immunity, that the systems designed to punish wrongdoing break down when confronted with sufficient resources. They showed that corporations can commit felonies and their owners can escape personal liability, that bankruptcy can be weaponized to shield assets from creditors, that philanthropy can purchase enough institutional goodwill to delay reckoning for decades. Every lesson the Sacklers taught was a lesson about how little American society values human life when weighed against the interests of capital. The opioid epidemic killed more Americans than any war since the Civil War. It devastated communities in ways that will take generations to repair. It created hundreds of thousands of orphans, destroyed millions of families, cost trillions in economic damage and human potential. And the family most responsible for starting it emerged wealthy, free, and largely anonymous, their punishment limited to social discomfort and the removal of their name from buildings they no longer care about. The bodies are not coming back. The parents who overdosed in bathrooms while their children waited in the next room are not coming back. The young people who tried OxyContin at a party and progressed through addiction to heroin to fentanyl are not coming back. The community is hollowed out by addiction, where every family has lost someone, and every neighbourhood has empty houses, and every school has students in foster care, cannot be rebuilt by settlement payments that amount to a few $1,000s per death. The damage is permanent and the compensation is symbolic and the perpetrators are comfortable, and the system that enabled all of this continues operating exactly as before. The Sackler name is slowly coming down from museum walls. Institutions that once celebrated their generosity now distance themselves from the association. The philanthropy that was supposed to purchase immortality has instead become evidence of corruption, a reminder that behind every great fortune lies a crime, or in this case several 100,000 crimes that happen to be classified as public health rather than homicide. The name removal provides a form of closure for activists who fought for years to break the immunity that Sackler money had purchased. But taking down a name is not justice, it is a gesture, a symbolic acknowledgement that something went wrong, a concession that cost the Sacklers nothing of material value. They have their billions, they have their freedom, they have their futures, and somewhere, in a mansion or a penthouse or a beachfront estate, members of a family with $10 billion are counting on you to forget.